very much, Dirk. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have a bit of a cold, so I'm not sure if I'm shouting at you or whispering. Apologies for that. So the reason I've been asked to do this, I think, is because for a few years I had some funding to support the political attitudes modules in the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey. And then Dirk had the brilliant idea of adding political attitudes modules for a couple of years to the Young Life and Time survey. For those very reasons, as we hear expressed in the views of those 16-year-olds, recognising that, of course, the political decisions being made now will impact most on the young people. And Chris has already identified some of the ways in which that's been happening, of course. The political decisions or indecisions are most acutely affecting young people today. So what I'm going to talk about, and I hope you can see the screen okay, because I'm going to be heavily relying on some graphic data, is those data from the political attitudes modules that were supported, but also look across 20 years of opinions that we've seen expressed in the Young Life and Time survey, particularly in relation to living in Northern Ireland and community relations in Northern Ireland. I want to acknowledge and thank Ben Rosher, my PhD student, for his help in analysing the data, and I also want to thank Emily Tatum, who was a master's student from Notre Dame, who helped me last year bring out some of the qualitative data. So I will too have some comments from the 16-year-olds who are completing that survey 2020-21, just to illustrate some of that. I should also make a note of thanks to my daughters Elsa and Rosa, on whom I road tested some of these political attitudes questions and had to substantially rewrite them as a result of their bewildered looks and the first iterations. It's worth probably just reflecting on what's happened, what's changed in those 20 years, and more to the point, actually, what hasn't changed. And when I look back at what was happening in 2003, when Young Life and Times first got underway, my goodness me, there's so much there that's familiar, like eerily so. So the Assembly had been suspended in the previous year, and then in the beginning of the year there was feuds within the UDA and Belfast, and warnings that was spinning out of control. There was a bomb from the Real IRA outside the law courts. There was an announcement the election that was expected in May was going to be postponed, again very familiar. On the 5th anniversary of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, the US President came and urged people to seize a chance of peace again. We had that recently with President Joe Biden visiting Ulster University. And then we have the struggles within the largest unionist party. Then the leadership, of course, was David Trimble, trying to win over support for an agreement that had been made between the British and Irish governments. Similar situation today with Jeffrey Donaldson trying to enable support from his party for an agreement made between the British government and the European Union. At that time, of course, Jeffrey Donaldson was one of the leading rebels in the Ulster Unionist Party, posing the challenge to David Trimble. There's such irony there. And then the US Special Envoy, at that time it's Richard Haas, today it's Joe Kennedy, saying he's optimistic that the devolution might be restored. And then we have the November election. So it did happen in the autumn, but again, quite familiar. The MLAs don't take their seats, as we saw last year. The MLAs didn't take their seats. This election is really significant, though, because what happened at that point was the DUP became the largest unionist party, Sinn Féin became the largest nationalist party in the Assembly. And one thing that's really worth noting is at that time, the unionist MLAs were significantly larger than the proportion of nationalist MLAs at the time, 57 seats compared to 40, and Alliance was sitting there at 6. So that is something that has changed, but still DP and Sinn Féin, the largest parties. So that was what it was like 20 years ago. A lot has happened since that time, so even though that's very familiar, we do know that some things have significantly changed. What about views in terms of community relations? This data, this chart is from the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey. This is the survey for over 18-year-olds. You can see from this how significantly you can see the views on whether relations will be better in 5 years' time or whether they are better than they were 5 years ago. So that's the yellow line at the top. So the dashed line is people saying things will be better. The unbroken yellow line is things are better than they were. So the optimistic view. And then the red lines are whether people think things will be worse or whether they are worse. So you can see that the flags protest in 2012 was particularly impactful, and people thinking things like having a negative view of community relations. You can see the peak just before that in 2009, after the Assembly got up and running again, after the St Andrews Agreement. Things began to improve in the 2014 or so, then the Brexit referendum happened in 2016, and things have sort of declined since then. You see the impact in 2020-21, sort of a sense of slight optimism, and then getting worse since that point in the context of the Assembly being suspended. Now this is the similar chart, so the same questions we've been asking for 20 years of the 16-year-olds. And one thing you notice is that the pattern is pretty similar to those of the adults. And again, you can see the impact of the flags protest. You can see that the peak of optimism was really around 2008-9. The Brexit referendum didn't seem to make a huge amount of difference, but what really did make a difference in people's views amongst the young people there is COVID. So we were asking, obviously, those 2020-21 questions in the context of COVID, and a declining sense of optimism then. And this is something that we see throughout this data, actually, the impact of COVID, as Chris has already touched on, actually. So now, this sense of optimism is not very much there compared to where it was before. We've come down considerably over the last 15 years, so only 31% thinking that things are better than they were or will be better, although still only 10-15% people say things are worse or will be worse. When asked about community relations in Northern Ireland, a theme that comes through in the qualitative data, so this is from 2020-21, is the sense that everybody's responsible. So it's not one particular side or community is responsible for that. That theme comes through quite a lot. And this is in response to a question where people are asked if they want to write their thoughts in relation to community relations in Northern Ireland. And what's striking is when the respondents are saying so, they're quite negative. So one person saying it's very sectarian, the hate will always be there. Things will never be at peace in a country with so much bad blood between religions and nationalities. Northern Ireland is an extremely racist and sectarian country, and I hate it. I think this comes from British colonialism. United Ireland would solve that. However, that may upset other communities. I wish sectarianism wasn't so prominent. Maybe workshops in schools or shared education programs would help raise a better generation for the future with hopefully less hate. So that seems quite negative. One thing we have when we're looking at the quantitative data on views about the community relations and the impact that religion has, so feeling very strongly, according to those quotes, that sectarianism still very much exists. We asked consistently over the last 20 years whether religion will always make a difference to the way people feel about each other in Northern Ireland. And you can see there's been very little change. So in 2003 it was 86% saying yes, and now it's 75% of people saying yes. There was a blip there in 2017, and we don't know what that was. Again, only a very small number, sort of 8 to 11%, saying it won't make a difference the way people feel about each other. One thing that is really interesting is bearing in mind the context within which this has happened. So in 2003, the respondents saying they had no religion was 12%. 45% of the respondents said they were Catholic, and 43% said they were Protestant. So you can understand in that context, 86% saying religion will always make a difference. 20 years later, we've got more than 3 times the proportion of respondents saying they have no religion. Well, they don't identify as having belonging to any religion. 35% Catholic, 25% Protestant, and yet they still think that religion will make a difference to the way people feel about each other. Now, in the context of asking about community relations, sectarianism, that could be seen as a negative thing. Of course, there could be a sense of a positive thing as well if all this was seen in a different context. A sense of belonging in Northern Ireland, again, rather a consistent pattern across 20 years. In the last 10 years. So generally speaking, it's a clear sense of belonging in Northern Ireland, although you can see the impact that COVID made in 2020. So down to 59% of people saying they have a sense of belonging in Northern Ireland, up to 63% in the last Young Life and Times. When we break this down by religious community, you can see that the Protestant respondents are more likely to say that they have a sense of belonging in Northern Ireland, and those saying they have no religion are least likely to say that. That was in the 2023 survey. And then on to politics. So this is one question slightly tweaked in relation to feedback from 16-year-olds when road testing the question. So have you heard of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? Only 6% say no, 43% say yes, it's important and relevant. There is a community difference there with 63% of Catholic respondents compared to 48% of Protestant respondents saying it's important and relevant. 29% saying it has some relevance, but mainly for older people. Only 7% say it's not relevant or important to their generation. And this is in relation to party support. So just the question, which party would you vote for? I've got here the data from 2021 and 2022, noting just quite how inconsistent it is. So in the last survey in 2022, when 15% said they wouldn't vote, you can see 26% say they don't know, 20% support for Sinn Féin, and 11% for DUP. And you can see there the 43% of Catholics saying they'd vote for Sinn Féin, 41% of Protestants voting for DUP, 24% of those with no religion saying they wouldn't vote, and 34% of those with no religion saying they don't know. And that little quote there is from a respondent in 2020. So on the bigger question, what sort of questions really matter to people in relation to Northern Ireland? On the positive side, you can see that there's a sense of pride in living in Northern Ireland. This question, 49% saying they're proud to live in Northern Ireland. And you can see 63% people saying it's important that Northern Ireland does have its own executive and assembly. And 48% say that voting in elections is the best way to make a difference. However, the question is what happens when people have voted? Who end up there making those decisions? And only 14% say that the government in Northern Ireland does generally a good job, with 3% saying that they strongly agree that's so. So 53% of the view that it doesn't do a good job, so definitely a wish for reform in that regard. And again, only 16% of people saying that they trust local decisions to make, local politicians to make the best decisions for Northern Ireland, and 42% saying they don't trust. So those are worrying. So they recognise the importance of these institutions, but they don't trust those who are in place when they're functioning to make the best decisions for Northern Ireland. And then in terms of what priorities, what do you think people should be making decisions on or focusing on when they're sitting there in the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive? Now this is from the survey in 2020, 21. You can see how low down the list of priorities Northern Ireland's constitutional status comes. The greatest concern is around healthcare, including mental health, as Dirk's already touched upon. And we asked the question in a bit more detail in the 2022 survey. Again, you can see this lowest sense of priority for Northern Ireland's constitutional status, and highest concerns around cost of living, strong economy, good job, stable political system. And you can see that 56% of the respondents think that support services for mental health, so we specified in that question about mental health, of the view that it is very important for making Northern Ireland a good place to live. when we broke this down by backgrounds of how people are identifying, as whether they identify as nationalist, unionist, or neither, you can see there are significant differences there. So the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is of most concern for those who identify as unionist, unsurprisingly, of least concern to those who identify as neither. A vibrant culture and cultural activities is high concern for those identifying as nationalists compared to others. And then rights protections is a priority for those identifying as neither, and a lesser priority for, at least priority for unionists. So those are interesting findings. I think that there's some significant differences there, but you can see how much of a concern cost of living and support for mental health and well-being is across all communities. I have to mention Brexit. Sorry. So these are some really interesting quotes, and actually I used this quote last week speaking at a conference in France, because it just summarises so much. There's so much in this quote from the 16-year-old respondents in relation to the impact of Brexit and the protocol and all of that. I believe that outsiders, particularly the Westminster, Dublin and Brussels governments, have little or no understanding of the deep divisions between communities in Northern Ireland. As a result, their recent political decisions have had little or no regard for community relations here, and have certainly made them worse. I'm particularly concerned by the lack of control that people of Northern Ireland have over these decisions that deeply impact community relations between us. You can see why I used it in a presentation. It just says it all. This is an interesting quote now about the impact that Brexit has had on that sense of community relations, and this might explain to some degree the decline in optimism about community relations that we've seen since Brexit, and both the adults and then the 16-year-olds. Up until recently, I believe my generation didn't really care very much about religion or the divide between Protestants and Catholics. However, after the rioting took place because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, I believe it will take many more generations for Northern Ireland to become a place that is tolerant to people of all backgrounds. Now, trying to uncover a wee bit more about why it is that there's that sense of significance for Brexit and all of that in community relations. I think it really is notable that the British government and its role and the decisions that have been made is identified by some of our respondents in the qualitative comments in 2020-21. And the particular concern comes from unionist respondents in this regard. So the fact that the British government has time and time again ignored or overlooked the nuanced and unique problems in Northern Ireland, due to the Irish Sea Border Protocol, mean that rioting among the youth and suspicion among the older generations will most likely to continue. So recognition or perception of the significance of the actions of the British government affecting the situation here. The next quote is again from a young unionist, strongly of the view that the government's decisions have been very significant and having a negative impact. I think the government needs to listen to our community much more than they do currently. Trying to cancel our protests, our parades, slap a border between us and our country, bring us closer to United Ireland. It's ridiculous. This behaviour will not be tolerated. If this behaviour continues, it will rise to war. And if war is what is needed to save our land, best believe our men will do it. This is very resonant of the of some of the comments made by Evidence to Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. You may remember a couple of years ago that really got a lot of attention at the time. So the expression of frustration and concern and a sense of helplessness there. Looking at the quantitative data, what difference has it made? So this is why I'm doing some comparison with the Northern Ireland Life and Times. So we've been asking in the NILT since 2016 whether Brexit makes people feel differently about United Ireland. And amongst the young people, you can see 38% saying it makes no difference, 30% saying it makes them more in favour. These are the results from the Northern Ireland Life and Times. And you can see amongst the adults, the over 18-year-olds, 38% saying it makes them more in favour of United Ireland, 42% saying it makes no difference. So there's not significant difference there, although more people in favour, greater proportion in favour as a result of Brexit. So let's get on to those constitutional questions. So in terms of political identity, 29% of the respondents to Young Life and Times in 2022 describe themselves as nationalists, 24% as neither, 26% as unionist, 21% saying they don't know. And this is compared with the Life and Times, where we've seen for a long time now the plurality saying that they're neither unionist nor nationalist, 26% nationalist, 31% unionist. So what is really striking there is the 21% saying they don't know, which in and of itself points to the sense of irrelevance of that question or that categorization anyway. On the question of whether people would vote yes if there was a referendum tomorrow, 35% saying yes, 37% saying no, 16% don't know, 12% wouldn't vote. These are the results from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. So exactly the same proportion, so 35% saying that they would vote for United Ireland if the referendum was held tomorrow. A greater proportion, 46%, compared to 37% saying they would vote against. 8% wouldn't vote, which isn't significantly different to the to the 16-year-olds, and 10% saying that they don't know, compared to 16 of the Young Life and Times. And we've also been asking consistently a question in Northern Ireland Life and Times about whether the United Kingdom is likely to still exist in 20 years' time. So we've asked that in the last few years, and we asked this in the Young Life and Times as well. And what's interesting here is that in the Northern Ireland Life and Times, there's less expectation that the UK will exist in 20 years' time. So a higher proportion of the 16-year-olds think that it's likely the UK will continue to exist. So to conclude, in summary, so on community relations, we can see the general pattern of peak in optimism around 2008-9, and decline since then, a bit of a blip of Brexit, impact of COVID, impact of having the Assembly suspended. You can see that amongst the 16-year-olds as well as amongst the Life and Times, the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey results. So 31% think things will get better, 10% of respondents think it'll get worse. We see 3/4 thinking that religion will be important in the way people view each other in Northern Ireland, even though more than three times as many today describe themselves as having no religion compared to 20 years ago. We see this generally a high sense of belonging to Northern Ireland, particularly amongst Protestant respondents, but that is pretty high, it's around 60%. In terms of politics, the plurality believe that the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is relevant and important to them, to their generation. We see low levels of trust in politicians, which of course is not unique to 16-year-olds. We also see that amongst the Life and Times survey, amongst adults, but the levels of trust are particularly low amongst 16-year-olds. Low confidence in Northern Ireland government in the sense that it's doing a generally bad job. But nonetheless, there is that strong support for having a devolved assembly and executive and wish to see it functioning. Northern Ireland's constitutional status is of lowest priority, although it is slightly higher priority amongst unionist respondents. Much more concern to the 16-year-old respondents is the cost of living, economy, possibility of having a good job, a stable political system, and mental health support. On Brexit, there was a re-emergence of the sense of relevance of division, particular frustration at the lack of controls over decisions in Northern Ireland, and particularly the sense that the decisions being made at that level have a real impact on community relations. It's that extraordinary capacity for those very high-level decisions to impact literally on the ground in Northern Ireland, and then the sense of that loss of control there being felt acutely among 16-year-olds, I think, is really notable. Particular anger is expressed there among some unionist response towards the British government and its role in that regard. And then on the constitutional future, we do see the emergence of this fourth category. So this increasing proportion of young people saying that they don't know whether they're unionist, nationalist or neither. They're not more nationalist than adults, notably, but they are less unionist if we're talking broad terms about the bloc. They are less able than adults to envisage change in the constitutional status quo, so they do think that it's more likely that the UK will exist in 20 years' time compared to the way that over 18-year-olds think, but it is possibly because they think about it less. And there I will conclude by wishing Young Lifetimes a very happy birthday. Thank you.